The morning mist clung to the gardens of Windsor Castle like a shroud, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to mirror the heavy emotions weighing on the royal family. Kate stood by the tall windows of the East Wing, her fingers tracing patterns on the cold glass as she watched the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens below. The weight of what she had discovered the night before pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had always prided herself on being observant, a skill that had served her well in navigating the complex world of royal protocol and family dynamics. But sometimes, she reflected, seeing too much could be its own curse. The conversation she had overheard between two senior palace staff members had shattered her understanding of a situation she thought she knew completely. The sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor behind her made Kate turn. Charles approached with his characteristic measured gait, his face bearing the weight of recent events that had tested the family's resilience. His eyes, usually bright with warmth when he saw her, today held a shadow of exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "Good morning, Kate," Charles said softly, joining her at the window. "I was hoping to find you here. We need to discuss what happened yesterday during Anne's meeting with the charity representatives." Kate nodded, though her throat felt tight with the knowledge of what she needed to share. Yesterday's events had been troubling enough on their surface. Princess Anne had excused herself abruptly from an important meeting with representatives from 3 major charities she patronized, claiming sudden illness. But Kate had seen Anne just minutes before the meeting, and she had appeared perfectly healthy, even energetic as she reviewed her notes. "Charles," Kate began, then paused, choosing her words carefully. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the room, and she found herself studying the patterns they made on the Persian carpet. "There's something you need to know about Anne's situation. Something that changes everything we thought we understood." Charles turned to face her fully, his expression growing more serious. He had learned to recognize the tone in Kate's voice that indicated she had uncovered something significant. In their years of working together on family matters, he had come to deeply respect her insights and her ability to see connections that others missed. "What is it?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The family had been through enough upheaval in recent months, and he had hoped that Anne's sudden withdrawal from her duties was simply the result of overwork or minor health concerns. Kate moved away from the window and gestured toward the sitting area where 2 comfortable chairs faced each other across a small table. The room felt suddenly too large, the formal portraits on the walls seeming to watch their conversation with silent judgment. She settled into one of the chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I discovered something last night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about why Anne has been avoiding her public engagements, why she's been so distant with everyone lately. It's not what any of us thought." Charles took the chair across from her, leaning forward slightly. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the passage of time with its steady tick, each second feeling weighted with importance. He had noticed Anne's unusual behavior over the past several weeks, but had attributed it to the stress of managing her extensive charitable commitments alongside the increased scrutiny that came with recent family changes. Kate took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she needed to say. "I was walking past the blue drawing room last night around 10 o'clock when I heard voices. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized Anne's voice immediately. She was talking to someone on the phone, and she sounded broken, Charles, completely unlike herself." The word broken hung in the air between them. Charles knew his sister well, had watched her navigate decades of public service with unwavering strength and dignity, and was known for her directness, her no-nonsense approach to her duties, and her remarkable emotional resilience. To hear her described as broken was almost incomprehensible. "What was she saying?" Charles asked, though he could see from Kate's expression that the answer would be difficult to hear. Kate closed her eyes for a moment, as if replaying the conversation in her mind. She was talking about a letter she received 3 weeks ago, a letter that contained information about something that happened 30 years ago, something she thought was buried and forgotten forever. The room seemed to grow colder, and Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. 30 years ago would place the events in the early 1990s, a time of significant upheaval for the royal family, when tabloid scrutiny was at its peak and several family crises had dominated headlines for months. She kept saying, they know everything. Kate continued, her voice growing stronger as she pushed through the difficult revelation. She was crying, Charles. I've never heard and cry before, not in all the years I've known her. But she was sobbing on that phone, talking about how everything she's worked for, everything she's built could be destroyed. Charles felt his stomach tighten with dread. And charitable work was more than just royal duty to her. It was her passion, her way of making a meaningful contribution to the world. The thought of that being threatened by some revelation from the past was almost unthinkable. Kate reached in her jacket pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper. After she finished her call, she threw something in the fireplace. I waited until she left, then I went in and managed to retrieve this small piece that hadn't completely burned. She handed the partially charred paper to Charles, who took it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar, and only a few words were still legible. Investigation complete. Evidence preserved. Your choice how this proceeds. Charles stared at the fragment, his mind racing through possibilities. An investigation implied wrongdoing, but what couldn't possibly have done 30 years ago that would warrant this kind of threat now? She had always been the most dutiful member of the family, the one who never caused scandals or attracted negative attention. There's more, Kate said quietly. I heard her mention a name during the conversation. Dr. Margaret Thornfield. She said the name with such fear in her voice, such recognition. Charles, I think this Dr. Thornfield is connected to whatever happened 30 years ago. The name meant nothing to Charles immediately, but he made a mental note to have it investigated discreetly. The idea that someone was potentially blackmailing or threatening his sister filled him with a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. Kate stood and walked back to the window, her silhouette outlined against the pale morning light. She's been carrying this burden alone for weeks, Charles. No wonder she's been withdrawing from her duties, from all of us. She's terrified that whatever this is will not only destroy her reputation, but will damage the entire family. Charles joined her at the window, both of them looking out at the peaceful grounds where nothing seemed to hint at the turmoil churning within the castle walls. He thought about all the times in recent weeks when he had noticed and seeming distracted or distant, how she had declined several family dinners and had been notably quiet during the few public events she had attended. We need to find out what this is really about, Charles said finally, his voice firm with resolve. And shouldn't have to face this alone, whatever it is. But we need to be careful. If someone is indeed threatening her, we can't risk making the situation worse by being heavy-handed. Kate nodded, though her expression remained troubled. There's something else, Charles. Something about the way she was talking on the phone. She mentioned making a decision soon, about whether to give them what they want or to let the truth come out. She sounded like she was leaning toward just giving in to whatever demands were being made. This revelation struck Charles like a physical blow. The idea of and surrendering to blackmail went against everything he knew about his sister's character. But he also understood that fear for the family's reputation could drive even the strongest person to consider desperate measures. We can't let her sacrifice herself, Charles said firmly. Whatever happened 30 years ago, we'll face it together as a family. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Kate turned to face him, and he could see the determination in her eyes that had drawn him to rely on her judgment in family matters. I have an idea about how to approach this, but it will require trust, and right now, she's not likely to trust anyone with this information. Charles considered this, understanding the delicate nature of the situation, and valued her privacy and independence above almost everything else. Convincing her to open up about something that was clearly causing her tremendous distress would require careful handling. What do you suggest? He asked. Kate was quiet for a long moment, watching the gardeners work among the rose bushes below. I think we need to approach this indirectly. If we confront and directly about what I overheard, she'll likely shut down completely or simply deny everything. But if we can find out more about this Dr. Thornfield and what connection she has to, and we might be able to understand the situation well enough to help without forcing and to relive whatever trauma she's tried to protect us from. The wisdom of this approach was immediately apparent to Charles, and had always been fiercely protective of the family, sometimes to her own detriment. If she believed that keeping this secret was protecting them, she would continue to suffer in silence rather than risk exposing them to whatever consequences she feared. I'll have my private secretary make some discreet inquiries about Dr. Thornfield, Charles said. Perhaps we could trace her connection to, and without raising any red flags. In the meantime, we need to find a way to support, and without making it obvious that we know something is wrong. Kate nodded, though her expression remained concerned. I'm worried about how long she can maintain this facade. The stress is clearly taking a physical toll on her, and if she's being pressured to make a decision soon, we may not have much time to figure this out. They stood together in contemplative silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what Kate had discovered. The morning sun had risen higher, burning away some of the mist and revealing the full beauty of the gardens below. But the peaceful scene felt almost mocking given the turmoil they now knew was consuming one of the family's most steadfast members. Charles finally broke the silence. I want you to know how much I appreciate you bringing this to me, Kate. I know it couldn't have been easy to share what you overheard, especially knowing how much and values her privacy. Kate smiled sadly. Family looks after family, Charles. That's what you taught me when I joined this household, and has always been there for all of us, especially during difficult times. Now it's our turn to be there for her, even if she doesn't know she needs us yet. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Charles called for the visitor to enter, and his private secretary, James, appeared with a concerned expression. Your Majesty, James said formally, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Princess Anne has just sent word that she's canceling all her engagements for the remainder of the week. She cited health concerns, but her staff seems quite worried about her state of mind. Charles and Kate exchanged meaningful glances, both understanding that Anne's situation was deteriorating more rapidly than they had feared. The pressure she was under was clearly becoming unbearable, and whatever decision she was contemplating was apparently becoming more urgent. Thank you, James, Charles said. Please arrange for me to have a private conversation with Princess Anne this afternoon. Tell her it's about family business, nothing formal. After James left, Kate turned to Charles with increased urgency in her voice. We may need to accelerate our timeline. If Anne is canceling engagements and her staff is worried, she might be preparing to do something drastic. Charles nodded grimly, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. As the head of the family, protecting and fell to him, but he also had to consider the broader implications for the monarchy and the family's public role. Whatever secrets Anne was guarding, whatever threats she was facing, they would need to be handled with the utmost care and discretion. The morning that had started with such promise now felt fraught with uncertainty and danger. But Charles also felt a sense of determination growing within him, and had spent her entire life serving the family and the nation with unwavering dedication. Now it was time for the family to serve her, to protect her from whatever forces were threatening to destroy the peace and purpose she had worked so hard to build. As Kate prepared to leave to begin her own investigation into the mysterious Dr. Thornfield, Charles remained at the window, watching the gardeners continue their patient work among the roses. He found himself hoping that, like the garden, the family would be able to weather this storm and emerge stronger and more beautiful than before. But first, they would need to understand exactly what they were fighting against, and time was clearly running short. 3 days had passed since Kate's revelation, and the atmosphere within the castle had grown increasingly tense. Charles found himself studying Anne's face during their brief encounters, searching for signs of the emotional turmoil Kate had described. What he saw disturbed him deeply. His sister who had always carried herself with military precision and unshakable confidence, now seemed to move through the halls like a ghost of herself. Kate's investigation into Dr. Margaret Thornfield had yielded troubling results. The woman was a retired psychiatrist who had specialized in treating trauma victims, particularly those who had experienced abuse within institutional settings. Her practice had been based in London during the 1990s, and she had gained a reputation for her discretion when working with high-profile clients who needed absolute confidentiality. The discovery had opened up a realm of possibilities that Charles found deeply disturbing. What kind of trauma could and have experienced 30 years ago that would require the services of such a specialist? And why was this information surfacing now, decades later? Charles had arranged to meet with, and in the Queen's private study, a room that held decades of family history within its walls. The afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, casting the room in a warm but somber glow. Family portraits watched from the walls, silent witnesses to countless private conversations and difficult decisions. And entered precisely on time, as always, but Charles immediately noticed the changes Kate had described. His sister's usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of strain. Her clothes, while still perfectly pressed, seemed to hang differently on her frame, as if she had lost weight. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and there was a brittle quality to her smile that hadn't been there a month ago. "You wanted to see me about family business?" and asked, settling into the chair across from Charles's desk. Her voice carried its usual crispness, but Charles detected an underlying tension, like a wire stretched too tight. Charles had spent considerable time planning this conversation, knowing that one wrong word could cause and to retreat completely. He needed to find a way to offer support without revealing that he knew about her secret burden. "I've been concerned about you lately," Charles began carefully. "You've seemed distant, and your staff mentioned that you've been canceling engagements. I want to make sure you know that if there's anything troubling you, anything at all, you can talk to me about it." Anne's reaction was immediate and telling. Her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, and her hands clasped together in her lap with enough force that her knuckles turned white. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped, and Charles caught a glimpse of the fear and exhaustion Kate had described. "I'm simply tired, Charles," and replied, her voice perhaps a shade too quick. "The charitable commitments have been particularly demanding this season, and I thought it wise to take some time to recharge. There's nothing for you to worry about." Charles leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but persistent. "And we've known each other for over 70 years. I can tell when something is weighing on you. This isn't about being tired from work. This is something else entirely." For a long moment, and stared at her hands, and Charles could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. He could almost feel her weighing whether to trust him with whatever burden she was carrying. The silence stretched between them, filled with decades of shared experiences and mutual support. "Charles," and finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "some things are better left buried. Some truths do more harm than good when they're brought to light." The admission was more than Charles had expected, and it confirmed his worst fears about the seriousness of the situation, and was essentially acknowledging that there was indeed a truth she was hiding, something significant enough that she believed revealing it would cause harm. "Who decides what truths should be buried?" Charles asked quietly. "And who has the right to dig them up when it serves their purposes?" Anne's head snapped up, her eyes sharp with sudden alarm. "What do you mean by that?" Charles realized he had pushed too far too fast, and he quickly tried to recover. "I mean that sometimes people from our past try to exploit old situations for their own gain. If someone is threatening you in some way, you don't have to face it alone." And stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small area in front of the fireplace. Her movements were agitated, lacking her usual controlled grace. Charles watched as she seemed to wrestle with a decision, opening and closing her mouth several times as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. "You don't understand," and finally said, stopping her pacing to face Charles directly. Some mistakes can never be undone, never be forgiven. Some things we do in our youth, when we're scared and naive, can come back to destroy not just ourselves, but everyone we love. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Charles felt his heart break for his sister. Whatever had happened to her 30 years ago was clearly something that had haunted her ever since, a burden she had carried in silence while maintaining her public duties and supporting the family through countless crises. And Charles said, rising from his chair and moving toward her, "Whatever happened, whatever you think you did wrong, we can face it together. The family can weather any storm if we stand united." Anne's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Can we, Charles? Can the monarchy survive another scandal? Another revelation about family members behaving badly? The public trust is already so fragile, and the media would have a field day with something like this." Charles could see that Anne's primary concern wasn't for herself, but for the institution they all served. She was willing to sacrifice her own peace of mind, possibly even her health, to protect the monarchy from whatever damage she believed her secret could cause. "What happened 30 years ago that has you so frightened?" Charles asked directly, deciding that subtle approaches weren't working, and turned away from him, staring into the fireplace where no fire burned. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that Charles had to strain to hear her. "I was being treated by a psychiatrist named Dr. Margaret Thornfield," she admitted. "I was having difficulties, personal difficulties that I couldn't handle on my own." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. Kate's research had been correct, and was confirming the connection. But he sensed there was much more to the story than what Anne was revealing. "What kind of difficulties?" he pressed gently. Anne was quiet for so long that Charles began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she needed to get them out before she lost her nerve. "I was being stalked by someone, a man who had become obsessed with me after a public event. He was sending letters, showing up places where he knew I would be, making threats. The security team was handling it, but I was falling apart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. Dr. Thornfield was recommended as someone who specialized in helping people deal with that kind of psychological trauma." Charles felt a wave of anger on behalf of his sister. The idea that she had been terrorized by a stalker while trying to fulfill her public duties was infuriating. But he also sensed that this was only part of the story. "That's nothing to be ashamed of," and Charles said firmly, "seeking help for trauma is exactly what you should have done. Why would anyone try to use that against you now?" And turned back to face him, and Charles was shocked to see tears beginning to form in her eyes. In all his years, he had never seen his strong, composed sister cry. "Because of what happened during my treatment," and whispered, "because of what I told Dr. Thornfield in those sessions, because of what I confessed to doing." The weight of her words hung in the air like a physical presence. Charles could see that they had reached the heart of whatever was tormenting and the secret she had guarded for 3 decades. "What did you tell her?" Charles asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer, and sank back in her chair, all of her usual poise completely gone. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her secret was physically crushing her. "The stalker wasn't just sending letters and following me," and said, her voice trembling. "One night, he broke into my private residence. He was in my bedroom when I came home from an evening engagement. He had plans for me, Charles. Terrible plans that he had written about in detail in his letters." Charles felt his stomach clench with horror and rage. The thought of someone violating his sister's private space, threatening her in such an intimate and terrifying way, filled him with a murderous fury. "What happened?" he asked, though he was no longer sure he wanted to know. Anne's tears began to flow freely now, years of suppressed emotion finally, breaking through her carefully constructed barriers. "I fought him," she said through her sobs. "There was a struggle, and I managed to get to the fireplace poker. I hit him with it to defend myself, but, Charles, I didn't just hit him once. I kept hitting him. I was so scared, so angry, so traumatized by what he had put me through for months. I couldn't stop myself. Charles felt the room spinning around him as the implications of Anne's confession began to sink in. His sister was describing a violent encounter that had clearly gone far beyond simple self-defense. Is he? Charles couldn't bring himself to finish the question, and nodded, her entire body shaking with the force of her sobs. He died, Charles. I killed him. It was ruled self-defense by the police, and the whole incident was kept quiet by the palace security team. But I told Dr. Thornfield everything. I told her about how it felt to keep hitting him even after he was down, about how a part of me enjoyed making him pay for what he had put me through. I told her things that made it clear it wasn't just self-defense anymore. The revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. His sister, who had spent decades serving the public with grace and dignity, was carrying the burden of having taken a life. Not just in self-defense, but in what she clearly believed had crossed the line into something darker and more violent. And Charles said softly, moving to kneel beside her chair, "You were defending yourself from someone who was going to assault you, possibly kill you. The fact that you fought back, that you made sure he could never hurt you or anyone else again, doesn't make you a monster." But even as he spoke the words, Charles could understand why and had been so terrified of this information becoming public. The media and the public would not be as understanding. They would focus on the violence, on the fact that a member of the royal family had killed someone, regardless of the circumstances. "Dr. Thornfield has kept your confidence for 30 years, Charles said, trying to find some hope in the situation. Why would she break that trust now? And wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, trying to regain some composure. "She's not the one threatening me. Someone else has gotten hold of her files. Somehow. They have recordings of our sessions. Charles. Recordings where you can hear me describing in detail how I felt when I was beating him to death. How I enjoyed making him suffer for what he had done to me." The scope of the threat became clear to Charles in that moment. It wasn't just the fact that Anne had killed her stalker that was being used against her. It was evidence that she had taken pleasure in the violence, that she had continued attacking him beyond what was necessary for self-defense. In the wrong hands, such recordings could be edited and presented to make and look like a cold-blooded killer rather than a trauma victim defending herself. "Who has the recordings?" Charles asked. "What do they want?" And took a shuddering breath, clearly struggling to maintain control. "I don't know who they are. The communications have been anonymous. But they want me to resign from all my charitable positions and withdraw from public life entirely. They say if I don't, they'll release the recordings to every major media outlet in the country." Charles felt a cold fury building inside him. Someone was using his sister's deepest trauma, her most vulnerable moment, to destroy the life she had built in service to others. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "We're going to find out who's doing this," Charles said firmly, "and we're going to stop them. You're not resigning from anything, and you're certainly not withdrawing from the meaningful work you do." And looked at him with a mixture of hope and despair. "How can we fight this, Charles? Even if we find out who's threatening me, the damage will be done once those recordings become public. My reputation, the family's reputation, everything I've worked for will be destroyed." Charles stood and began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities. There had to be a way to protect, and without simply giving in to the blackmailer's demands. But he also knew that they were dealing with someone ruthless enough to exploit a woman's trauma for their own gain, and such people rarely back down easily. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with," Charles said finally. "I want to know how these recordings were obtained, who has access to them, and what their real motivation is. People don't usually go to this much trouble for blackmail unless they have a larger agenda." And nodded, though she still looked fragile and uncertain. "There's something else, Charles. The person threatening me says they know about other members of the family as well. They hinted that mine isn't the only secret they have access to." This revelation sent a new chill through Charles. If the blackmailer had information about other family members, the threat was much larger than just Anne's situation. They could be dealing with someone who had been systematically gathering damaging information about the royal family for years, waiting for the right moment to use it. "We're going to need help," Charles said. Professional help from people who specialize in this kind of situation. And I need you to promise me something. And looked up at him with eyes that still held tears, but also showed a glimmer of the strength that had carried her through decades of public service. Promise me you won't make any decisions about resigning or withdrawing from public life without talking to me first, Charles said. Whatever this person is threatening, we face it together. That's what family means. And nodded. And for the first time in their conversation, Charles saw a hint of relief in her expression. She had been carrying this burden alone for weeks, convinced that she had to protect the family by sacrificing herself. Now, at least, she knew she wasn't facing the threat in isolation. But, as Charles helped his sister compose herself before they left the study, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were only seeing the tip of a much larger iceberg. Someone with access to decades-old psychiatric records was not an ordinary blackmailer. They were dealing with someone who had resources, patience, and a long-term plan. The battle to protect and the family was just beginning, and Charles had no idea how far his enemies were prepared to go to achieve their goals. The secure meeting room in the basement of Buckingham Palace had been swept for listening devices 3 times in the past 24 hours. Charles sat at the head of a polished oak table, flanked by his most trusted advisors and Kate, who had been instrumental in uncovering the threat against him. The gravity of their situation had necessitated bringing in outside expertise, and Charles had reluctantly agreed to involve Sir Malcolm Henley, a former intelligence officer who specialized in protecting high-profile individuals from sophisticated blackmail schemes. Sir Malcolm was a slight man in his 60s with penetrating gray eyes and an understated manner that belied the sharp intelligence that had made him invaluable to the security services for over 3 decades. He had reviewed all the information they had gathered about the threats against and his preliminary assessment had been both enlightening and deeply troubling. The level of sophistication we're dealing with suggests this isn't the work of an opportunistic blackmailer, Sir Malcolm explained, spreading several documents across the table. Someone has been planning this operation for years, possibly decades. The acquisition of Dr. Thornfield's psychiatric record alone would have required significant resources and expertise. Kate leaned forward, her expression tense with concern. What kind of resources are we talking about? Corporate espionage? Foreign intelligence? Sir Malcolm adjusted his reading glasses and consulted one of his reports. Dr. Thornfield's practice was completely legitimate and highly secure. Her files were stored in a private facility that specialized in maintaining confidential medical records for high-profile clients. Breaking into such a facility and accessing specific files without leaving a trace would require either insider access or the kind of technical expertise typically found in intelligence operations. Charles felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. The implications of Sir Malcolm's assessment were staggering. They weren't just dealing with a criminal trying to extort money from the royal family. They were potentially facing a coordinated attack on the monarchy itself, one that had been years in the making. You mentioned that the blackmailer hinted at having information about other family members, Sir Malcolm continued, looking directly at Charles. Have there been any other unusual incidents or approaches toward family members in recent months? Charles thought carefully, reviewing the past year for anything that might seem significant in light of this new threat. There have been several instances of increased media interest in old stories, photographers showing up at private events they shouldn't have known about, and a few incidents where family members felt they were being followed or watched. We attributed it all to the usual invasive coverage. I need detailed reports on all of those incidents, Sir Malcolm said firmly. What appears to be routine media intrusion might actually be surveillance operations designed to gather intelligence on your family's routines and vulnerabilities. Kate spoke up from her position at the table. There's something else we need to consider. The timing of this threat against Stan. Why now? She's been carrying this secret for 30 years. Why would someone choose this particular moment to exploit it? Sir Malcolm nodded approvingly at the question. That's exactly the right thing to ask. In my experience, Blackmailers don't usually wait 3 decades to use their leverage unless something has changed in their circumstances or their objectives. Charles pulled out a thick folder he had been dreading to discuss. I may have an answer to that question, but it's going to complicate our situation significantly. He opened the folder to reveal a series of newspaper clippings, government reports, and intelligence briefings that painted a troubling picture of recent political developments. 6 months ago, Parliament began debating the possibility of significant constitutional reforms that could affect the monarchy's role and funding, Charles explained. There have been growing calls for increased transparency and accountability, particularly regarding the royal family's finances and private activities. Sir Malcolm immediately grasped the implications. Someone wants to discredit the royal family at the exact moment when their future is being debated publicly. A well-timed scandal could tip public opinion toward more radical constitutional changes. Kate felt her heart sink as she realized the scope of what they were facing. This isn't just about an anymore, is it? Someone is trying to destroy the monarchy itself, and they're using its trauma as a weapon to do it. Charles nodded grimly. That's what I'm beginning to think. And secret is just the opening move in a larger campaign designed to bring down the institution. Sir Malcolm stood and began pacing around the room, his mind clearly working through the tactical implications of their situation. If that's the case, then simply protecting and isn't enough. We need to identify the people behind this operation and neutralize their ability to continue their attacks. How do we do that without exposing and secret in the process? Kate asked. The moment we start investigating aggressively, we risk drawing attention to exactly what they want to reveal. Sir Malcolm stopped pacing and turned to face the group. We're going to need Anne's cooperation for what I'm about to suggest. It's risky, but it might be our only chance to turn the tables on whoever is threatening your family. Charles felt his protective instincts flaring. I won't ask my sister to put herself in any more danger than she's already in. Actually, Sir Malcolm said carefully, I'm going to suggest that we let them think their blackmail is working. We have and publicly withdraw from some of our duties, citing health concerns. Meanwhile, we use that withdrawal as cover to conduct our own investigation without raising suspicions. Kate immediately saw the potential in the plan, but also its dangers. You want to use Anne as bait? Not bait exactly, Sir Malcolm corrected. More like giving our enemies a false sense of security while we work to identify them. If they think Anne is capitulating to their demands, they might become less careful about covering their tracks. Charles shook his head firmly. And has already been through enough. I won't subject her to more psychological trauma by asking her to participate in some kind of counterintelligence operation. With respect, Your Majesty, Sir Malcolm said, and is already participating in a counterintelligence operation. She's just on the losing side of it right now. What I'm proposing is a way to change that dynamic. Before Charles could respond, the door to the meeting room opened, and herself walked in. She looked better than she had in weeks, though Charles could still see the strain around her eyes. Her decision to confide in him had clearly lifted some of the burden she had been carrying. I apologized for interrupting and said, but I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have something to say. Charles gestured for her to take a seat, quickly introducing her to Sir Malcolm and explaining why they had brought him into their circle of trust, and listened calmly to the briefing about their suspicions regarding the larger conspiracy against the monarchy. When Sir Malcolm finished explaining his proposed strategy and was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. You're asking me to pretend to be intimidated by these people while you investigate them, and said finally, to continue living with this fear while you try to catch them in some mistake. I'm asking you to help us protect not just yourself, but the entire family, Sir Malcolm replied. Your situation is just the beginning. If we don't stop this now, they'll move on to other family members, other secrets they may have uncovered or fabricated. And looked at Charles, and he could see the internal struggle playing out in her expression. She had spent her entire adult life putting duty before personal comfort, but what they were asking of her went beyond normal sacrifice. "There's something I haven't told you," and said suddenly, "about the communications I've been receiving from the blackmailer." Charles felt his stomach drop. "What haven't you told us?" And reached into her handbag and withdrew a small electronic device that Charles didn't recognize. They didn't just send letters. 3 days ago, I received this. It's some kind of encrypted communication device. They've been sending me messages directly, and the latest one included specific instructions about how I'm supposed to announce my withdrawal from public life. Sir Malcolm immediately reached for the device, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had encountered similar technology before. "This is professional-grade equipment," Sir Malcolm said grimly. "Military or intelligence-level encryption. Whoever gave this to you has access to technology that's not available to ordinary criminals." Kate felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of instructions did they send?" And looked uncomfortable but pressed on. "They want me to give a public interview in 2 weeks, announcing that I'm stepping back from all royal duties due to personal health issues. They've even provided specific phrases they want me to use, language that they claim will prepare the public for more significant revelations about the royal family." Charles slammed his hand down on the table, his carefully controlled composure finally cracking. "They're not just trying to destroy you, Anne. They're using you to prepare the ground for attacks against all of us." Sir Malcolm was studying the device with intense concentration. "This changes everything. The fact that they're giving and specific scripts to follow confirms that this is part of a coordinated propaganda campaign. They want to control not just what information gets released, but exactly how the public receives and interprets it. What happens if I don't follow their instructions?" And asked. Sir Malcolm looked up from the device with a grave expression. "Based on the sophistication of their operation, I would expect them to release your psychiatric records immediately, probably accompanied by additional fabricated evidence designed to make your situation look even worse than it actually was." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the impossible choice facing Anne. She could follow the blackmailer's instructions and become a tool in their campaign against the monarchy, or she could refuse and face the immediate destruction of her reputation and potentially the reputation of the entire family. "There's a third option," Sir Malcolm said slowly, "but it's extremely risky, and it would require and to be willing to face her past trauma in a very public way." "What do you mean?" Charles asked, though he was beginning to suspect what Sir Malcolm might suggest. "We could get ahead of the story," Sir Malcolm explained, "and could voluntarily reveal the truth about what happened 30 years ago, but in her own words and on her own terms. If the public hears the full story of her trauma and self-defense directly from her, it becomes much harder for the blackmailers to use edited recordings to portray her as a monster." And went pale at the suggestion. "You want me to voluntarily tell the world about the most traumatic experience of my life? I want to give you the power to control your own narrative," Sir Malcolm replied. "Right now, your enemies have all the control. They decide when and how your story gets told. But if you tell it yourself first with full context and emotional honesty, you take that power away from them." Kate could see the wisdom in Sir Malcolm's suggestion, but she also understood the enormous personal cost it would require of Anne. Would that protect the family from their other threats? Partially, Sir Malcolm admitted. It would certainly reduce the impact of Anne's specific situation. But if they have other secrets about other family members, we'd still need to identify and neutralize the source of their intelligence. Charles looked at his sister, seeing the fear and exhaustion that had been weighing on her for weeks. The idea of asking her to relive her trauma publicly felt almost cruel, but he could also see that it might be their only path to freedom from this threat. And Charles said gently, "Whatever you decide, we'll support you completely. But I want you to know that I think Sir Malcolm is right about one thing. The only way to defeat people who use fear as a weapon is to refuse to be afraid." And was quiet for a long time, staring at the encrypted device that represented so much of her recent anguish. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "If I'm going to tell my story, I want to do it in a way that might help other people who have been through similar traumas, she said. If I'm going to expose my pain, I want it to serve some purpose beyond just protecting the family. Sir Malcolm nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. We can structure your revelation as part of a broader conversation about trauma, self-defense, and the importance of supporting victims rather than judging them. But first, and continued, her voice growing firmer with resolve, I want to know who has been doing this to us. I want to know who thought they could use my pain as a weapon against my family. And I want to make sure they can never do this to anyone else. Charles felt a surge of pride for his sister's courage, but also a deepening concern about the dangers they were about to face. They were essentially declaring war on enemies whose capabilities they didn't fully understand, and the stakes could not be higher. The battle for the future of the monarchy was about to begin in earnest, and none of them could predict what casualties they might suffer before it was over. The television studio felt like a battlefield prepared for war. Soft lighting had been arranged to create an intimate atmosphere, and could feel the weight of cameras, production crew, and the knowledge that millions of people would soon hear the most painful details of her life. She sat across from Sarah Matthews, a respected journalist known for her sensitive handling of difficult personal stories. But even Sarah's gentle demeanor couldn't calm the storm of emotions churning inside. In the control room, Charles and Kate watched through monitors, their anxiety palpable. Sir Malcolm stood behind them, speaking quietly into a secure phone, coordinating the security measures they had put in place for what they all knew would be a pivotal moment in royal history. 3 weeks had passed since Anne's decision to take control of her own narrative. During that time, Sir Malcolm's team had been working around the clock to trace the source of the blackmail operation. What they had discovered was more disturbing than any of them had imagined. We've identified at least part of the network, Sir Malcolm had reported to Charles just that morning. It appears to be a combination of disaffected former palace employees, corrupt journalists, and what we believe to be foreign intelligence operatives working to destabilize British institutions. The revelation that foreign powers might be involved in the plot against his family had shaken Charles deeply. It transformed what had seemed like a personal attack into a matter of national security, and it made his decision to speak publicly even more crucial. Now, as the interview was about to begin, Charles found himself whispering a prayer for his sister's strength and for the wisdom of their decision to fight back against their tormentors. Sarah Matthews began with gentle questions about Anne's decades of public service, her charitable work, and her dedication to causes ranging from healthcare to education, and answered with her characteristic directness. But Charles could see the tension in her posture as they approached the more difficult territory. "Princess Anne," Sarah said softly, "you've asked for this interview to address some very personal and painful experiences from your past. Can you tell us what prompted you to speak about these matters now?" And took a deep breath, drawing on reserves of courage that had sustained her through decades of public duty. "Because someone has been trying to use the most traumatic experience of my life as a weapon against my family and against the institution we serve. I refuse to let my pain be exploited by people who have no understanding of what I went through." The simple honesty of her words seemed to fill the studio with an almost electric energy. Charles felt his chest tighten with pride and anxiety as he watched his sister prepare to bare her soul to the world. 30 years ago, and continued, her voice growing stronger, I was the victim of a stalker who terrorized me for months. This individual sent threatening letters, followed me to public events, and eventually broke into my private residence with the intention of assaulting me. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression conveying both professional focus and genuine compassion. "That must have been an incredibly frightening experience," and nodded, and Charles could see tears beginning to form in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "It was. For months, I lived in constant fear. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, couldn't focus on my duties. The psychological impact was devastating." "What happened on the night of the break-in?" Sarah asked gently, and was quiet for a moment, and Charles could see her gathering herself for the most difficult part of her story. When I returned home from charity function, I found him in my bedroom. He had detailed plans for what he intended to do to me, plans he had described in his letters. In that moment, I knew that if I didn't fight back, I was going to die. The studio was completely silent except for the soft hum of cameras. Charles found himself holding his breath as and continued. There was a struggle, and I managed to reach a fireplace poker. I hit him to defend myself, and paused, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. But I didn't stop when he fell down. I was so frightened, so angry about what he had put me through for all those months. I kept hitting him until I was certain he could never hurt me or anyone else again. Sarah reached across and placed a gentle hand on Anne's arm. You were defending yourself against someone who had terrorized you and broken into your home intending to assault you. Yes, and said, wiping her eyes with a tissue, but I've carried the guilt of those extra moments, the violence that went beyond pure self-defense for 30 years. I sought help from psychiatrist Dr. Margaret Thornfield, who helped me work through the trauma and the guilt. Charles watched as Anne took another deep breath, preparing to address the core of the blackmail threat. Recently, someone obtained recordings of my therapy sessions with Dr. Thornfield and continued, her voice growing firmer with anger. They've been using these recordings, which contain my most vulnerable moments and private thoughts, to threaten me and my family. They wanted me to withdraw from public life and abandon the charitable work that gives my life meaning. Sarah's expression hardened with indignation. Someone has been blackmailing you with your own therapy sessions? Yes. And they made it clear that their goal isn't just to destroy me, but to damage the entire royal family and the institution of the monarchy itself. They're using my trauma as a weapon in a larger political campaign. In the control room, Charles saw Sir Malcolm nodding approvingly and was handling the interview exactly as they had planned, presenting herself as a victim fighting back rather than someone with something to hide. How did this affect you when the blackmail began? Sarah asked. Anne's composure briefly cracked, revealing the raw pain she had been carrying. I was terrified. I thought about giving in to their demands, about sacrificing everything I've worked for to protect my family from scandal. But then I realized that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to be afraid, to be ashamed of something that wasn't my fault. What changed your mind about staying silent? And straightened in her chair, and Charles could see the return of the strength that had made her such a formidable public figure for decades. My family changed my mind. My brother Charles, my sister-in-law Kate, and our advisors reminded me that bullies and blackmailers only win when good people are too frightened to fight back. Sarah nodded encouragingly. What do you want people to understand about your experience? And looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to the viewing audience, but to every person who had ever been victimized or traumatized. I want people to understand that surviving trauma doesn't make you weak. Seeking help for psychological wounds doesn't make you unstable. And fighting back against people who try to hurt you doesn't make you a monster. Her voice grew stronger with each word. I also want them to understand that there are people who will try to exploit our pain, our mistakes, our most vulnerable moments for their own gain. We cannot let them succeed. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with and providing additional details about the stalking, her recovery process, and her determination to continue her charitable work. Throughout it all, she maintained a balance between emotional honesty and dignified strength that Charles found deeply moving. As the interview concluded, Sarah made a final observation. Princess, and your decision to speak openly about this trauma takes tremendous courage, and smiled. And for the first time in weeks, Charles saw genuine peace in her expression. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Sarah. Courage is doing what's right despite being afraid. Today, I chose to stop being afraid. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, Charles felt a complex mixture of relief, pride, and continued anxiety, and had performed magnificently, presenting her story with exactly the combination of vulnerability and strength that would make it difficult for her enemies to twist her words against her. Kate moved to Anne's side immediately, offering both physical and emotional support as the adrenaline of the interview began to wear off. Anne looked exhausted, but also somehow lighter, as if sharing her burden publicly had finally allowed her to begin releasing the guilt and fear she had carried for so long. Sir Malcolm approached Charles with an update on their investigation. The response to the interview is already being monitored. Initial public reaction appears to be overwhelmingly supportive of Anne, with strong condemnation for anyone who would blackmail a trauma victim. "What about our blackmailers?" Charles asked. "How do you think they'll respond to this?" "They'll be furious," Sir Malcolm replied, "and just destroyed their most valuable weapon against your family. But that also makes them more dangerous. Desperate people do desperate things." Charles nodded, understanding that their battle was far from over. "Do we have any better leads on who's behind this?" Sir Malcolm glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Actually, yes. The interview was part of a larger strategy. While public attention was focused here, my team executed searches based on intelligence we gathered. We've identified several members of the network, including 2 former palace employees who had access to confidential family information." Kate looked up from comforting Anne. "Have they been arrested?" 3 arrests were made this morning, Sir Malcolm confirmed. "We're also working with international partners to track the foreign elements of the operation. The evidence we've gathered suggests this conspiracy goes much deeper than just threats against your family." And, who had been listening despite her exhaustion, spoke up with quiet determination. "I want to see this through to the end. I want to make sure these people can't do this to anyone else." Charles felt a surge of admiration for his sister's resilience. Even after the emotional ordeal of the interview, she was thinking about protecting others from similar attacks. "There will likely be more revelations in the coming weeks," Sir Malcolm warned. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence of other operations targeting public figures, journalists, and political leaders. This blackmail network appears to be part of a broader campaign to undermine British institutions." As they prepared to leave the studio, Charles reflected on how much had changed since Kate first overheard Anne's frightened phone conversation weeks ago. What had begun as a personal crisis for his sister had revealed a sophisticated attack on the monarchy itself and possibly on the stability of the nation. But he also felt hope for the first time in weeks. Anne's courageous decision to fight back had not only protected her from her blackmailers, but had also provided crucial intelligence that might help protect countless other potential victims. 3 months later, Charles stood in the same garden where Kate had first told him about Anne's distress. The investigation had led to the dismantling of an international network of blackmailers and information brokers with connections to foreign intelligence services and domestic criminal organizations. Several high-profile figures had been arrested, and dozens of victims had come forward to testify about their own experiences with blackmail and extortion, and had become an unexpected advocate for trauma victims and whistleblowers, using her experience to help others find the courage to speak out against those who would exploit their vulnerabilities. Her charitable work had expanded to include support for people dealing with stalking, blackmail, and other forms of psychological terrorism. Kate joined Charles by the window, both of them watching and work in the garden below. She moved with purpose and joy, tending to the roses with the same careful attention she brought to all her responsibilities. "She's stronger now than she was before all this started," Kate observed. Charles nodded, marveling at his sister's resilience. She faced her deepest fear and discovered it couldn't destroy her. That's a powerful kind of freedom. The crisis that had threatened to tear apart the royal family had instead revealed their capacity to support each other through the darkest of times. Anne's courage in confronting her blackmailers had not only saved her own reputation, but had helped protect countless others from similar attacks. As they watched and worked peacefully in the garden, both Charles and Kate understood that they had witnessed something remarkable. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding our fears, but from facing them with courage, honesty, and the support of those who love us. The sentence Kate had whispered to Charles weeks ago, revealing Anne's secret anguish, had ultimately led not to the family's destruction, but to their stronger unity and Anne's personal liberation. In the end, truth had indeed proven more powerful than fear, and love had proven stronger than the forces that sought to divide them.